No.
Senatrice Audette.
Senator Audette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, I move that the bill be read a second time.
Honourable Senator.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator Audette, seconded by the Honourable Senator Meiji, that this bill be now read a second time. On debate, Senator Audette.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Gadot inotode otasiwa le peuple Anishinaabe.
Honourable Senators, I rise today for the first time in 12 months as a senator, this time to speak to Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Reconciliation Council. This is a tough week for women, for Indigenous women. It's one full of emotions and history as well. Here's why I think it's important that this bill receive the support of my colleagues here in this beautiful chamber. It's an important step for many of us, not just us across Canada, not only to advance reconciliation, but also and above all to strengthen the social fabric of our country. It is also the culmination of many years of advocacy by all sorts of people, different groups, experts, thinkers, philosophers, survivors, our knowledge keepers and communities too. For a long time, we've been calling for greater accountability, greater responsibility as well from everyone, and that includes myself. I have this role and this responsibility. In my eyes, in my heart, this bill is more than necessary. It's also a step towards healing and repair. It takes us to act, leads us to act, to do more, to say more than just words, and to honor the truths of the survivors, those who spoke during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the families as well, or who perhaps who are on hand as well, or who perhaps are no longer at hand, and those bright lights that have gone too soon.
The National Council for Reconciliation will monitor the long-term process and evaluate, which is very important, and report to the implementation of the TRC's 94 call for actions. Vraiment important. And
truly important.
We'll respond also to the Action 53, call to Action 53, to create this National Council for Reconciliation. But also, where I think it's very important, it will respond also to those calls, and I want to mention them. 54, 56, 54, 55, and 56, which deal with funding, responsibility, and transparency agreement between the government and the council. Il y a des vérités qui sont dures.
There are hard truths that are hard to hear. They're tough. We must continue to listen to them. We have a duty to make them known. As you know, colleagues, the First Peoples, before the First Contacts, formed a sovereign society. They had their own systems of governance. We lived by rules of reciprocity, interdependence, and respect for the land and what the land offered us. Even back then, these systems represented the diversity within the First Peoples. I have said it before, and I'll say it again. Our ancestors welcomed what we call the great explorers. We welcomed them. We shared our knowledge, our science, our medicine, our ways of surviving on the land. But things have changed when the lure of gain overtook the relationship that existed between our nations. So we went from a military and economic alliance between our nations to an Indian problem. That would be the words that we learned when we were told about our history. We have gone from being welcoming people, strong people, to pagans, savages, inferior beings, lazy people, and so on. The list is long.
People, we are a product of residential school. I'm the daughter of the residential school survivor, Evelyn. Some of my colleagues here in this chamber are also residential school survivor. It is the story of my mom, my auntie, my uncles, my mother-in-law. It is also your story, my dear colleagues from the indigenous communities. But what if it was also all our story? Toute mon enfance.
All through my childhood, in my beautiful Meni-Utenam, the beautiful North Shore near Sept-Îles, Quebec, I normalized the effects of these destructive policies. I just thought that was our life, that the destructive policies and their impact, that they were simply our day-to-day life. Why did I think that? Because I didn't know. I didn't know where this violence came from, this way of being, this malaise. I did not know. And yet, in aging, we understand that we all have this same thread that connects us. But the domino effect is triggered, and we realize that our language, our identity with our territory, our relationship with our territory, and our dignity are ripped away from us. Marsa Pitique, a residential school survivor, wrote a book called I Am Coming Back, and he said, quote, "My story is your story. We have nothing to be ashamed of. Our children and grandchildren have a right to know. Removed from our family environment, uprooted from our culture and traditions, we believed that we had lost everything of our origins, so much so that we believed that these losses were deeply rooted in our hearts. Non-Indigenous people never knew the true history of residential schools. Those who knew it never dared to talk about it. Then one day, there were elders who had enough courage and bravery to come forward and speak out so that everyone would know. I salute those who wanted to speak out, and I thank them very much for that. The truth will be our healing," end quote. You'll understand that for me too, truth is healing. And understanding the past, my own people's past, or the past of Canadians and Indigenous peoples, is also healing. But how can I change my feeling of rage, hate, and shame, and stop normalizing the idea that we are savages, inferior beings, lazy ones, and so on? Well, for me, it was to go from de-victimization to reconstruction, to rebuild this painful path, to reclaim the history of my people and understand the history of my people and understand the systemic causes. It wasn't at school that I would learn these things, but through reading on my own, through listening, through commissions of inquiry. I learned that in 1844, according to the Bagot Commission report, that if Indigenous children were separated from their parents, that assimilation could be achieved. And in 1857, when I was head of the Indigenous Women of Quebec, I learned about the act to encourage the gradual civilization of the savage tribes. The idea was to gradually assimilate us, as if we weren't capable of being ourselves. And then, in 1867, the federal government took full control of the First Nations, and this authority spread to education for Indians as well. It became official in 1883 when the Prime Minister of the time, John A. Macdonald, set up residential schools to settle the Indian question and thus kill the Indian in the child. More than 150,000 children, and you've heard this, were taken by force from our ancestors to these cursed places, these residential schools, where abuse was the order of the day when they spoke their vernacular language, our beautiful languages. And now we needed to relearn. We still need to relearn our languages. Yet in 1922, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce published The Story of a National Crime, exposing the neglect of these students. If I had known when I was younger, I would have liked to have known. If I had known also why far too many of these children, these bright lights, did not ever return to their own territory. They were guinea pigs for research. They died of hunger, of sexual abuse, of psychological abuse, physical abuse. They left too early. At the same time, my grandmother, my nukun, told me what she had to suffer as many other women of her era. And she was met with silence in her community. The elders and parents sunk into darkness, destroying the family bonds, eroding family values, destroying parenting skills, breaking the right to love, breaking the reciprocity and respect and interdependence between mother and child, and between community towards its children. It broke so many things, and I've begun to understand. A few moons ago, we learned the sad news of these bright lights or little lights that were in unmarked graves. For so many of us, this was something that was already being said, already being explained. Luckily, the communities did incredible work, difficult work, but important.
De ces petits êtres lumière qui ont quitté pendant la période des pensionnats.
They worked to locate and commemorate the children who died in the residential schools. As devastating and difficult as these realities are, they are part of Canada's history. We cannot undo the past, but we must use our knowledge of these truths to repair and do better in the future. I know I don't have to convince you of this dark history, this dark chapter in our country's history. You have already acted. But remember why it is important to say this, because we are many here, standing here in the other place, and across Canada and around the world, who come from this country, this territory, who are standing today and who are teaching others, reminding us of this important history. I also carry in my heart every day, like many of you, all those courageous, strong, resilient people who are still alive, who have suffered or continue to suffer, but who are transmitting their languages, their knowledge, their ceremonies, and their spirituality to us, their knowledge. I thank them. Our paths to recovery are multiple, and we must respect these different options and the pace at which people move forward. Colleagues, I would like to share with you how this bill came about in last June, in the other place. This was a nice example of sharing. In 2019, a 6-person interim board, including Métis, First Nations, and Inuit, was formed, and the board included a former TRC commissioner. The board was given the mandate to reflect on and make proposals for this National Reconciliation Council. What should be its name, its vision, mandate, mission, structure, funding, and recommendations on a legislative framework for consultation. The board traveled, perhaps virtually, through various countries since 1973 until now. There have been more than 30 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. In other words, the board took a look at what was happening elsewhere. Once the commissions that had been completed were done, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that several entities were created to address these commissions' recommendations. And these entities have been models. They've tabled reports, recommendations. We have a mandate with a beginning and an end. Since we don't want to lose momentum, we are suggesting that there be a transition committee so that this issue remain on the political agenda and not simply disappear. Last December, this transition committee reviewed, first of all, was struck and then reviewed the proposed legislative framework. It met with members of the academic community, Indigenous experts, lawyers, thinkers, visionaries, men and women in various regions. There were even artists among them, to ensure that the committee is the right work. The transition committee, suggested recommendations and emphasized that the bill had to be introduced as soon as possible. Why? Because many people would like to see this council become a reality in their lifetime. I say thank you then to everyone who took part from the very beginnings. You demonstrated great leadership at the interim board and on the transition committee. You were instrumental in this process, and I thank you. The bill arrived in the other place on June 22nd of this year. It was tabled, and during the fall, it passed second reading and was referred to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. That was on October 6th. 32 witnesses, individuals, organizations, chiefs, men and women came and provided suggestions to the Standing Committee on how to improve the bill. Many of these changes are now contained in the version of the bill that we have before us today. Senators, this bill provides for a formal structure which is essential to achieving sustainable progress and anchoring that progress, above all, anchoring that progress for the future, whether that progress be governmental or other, progress that needs to be made every single day and in the long term. Imagine if we had set up this kind of mechanism following the Royal Commission on Indigenous Peoples in 1996. Just imagine. I was there. I was a witness with my first son.
La mise à jour de l'an 1, 5 ans après, 10 ans après, 20.
If we had done so, we could now report on implementation 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later. Hence the importance of setting up necessary mechanisms to ensure the implementation of calls to action. And this is essential for me. so that we can not only improve the well-being of First Peoples, but rebuild our relationships. There are gulfs right now. We need to rebuild our relationships, but we also need accountability, not just among ourselves, but to Canadians, Quebecers, who are increasingly informed, better informed, and aware of First Peoples' challenges. They deserve this as well. I'd like to talk to you now about the objectives and principles of this proposed legislation. Well, there's establishing the National Reconciliation Council. It needs to be independent, nonpartisan, permanent, and Indigenous-led. This bill will also serve as the legal framework for the National Reconciliation Council. It will define the Council's functions, including monitoring reconciliation and reporting annually to Parliament and to Canadians. It will state the federal government's obligations to assist the Council in achieving its mission, and it will describe procedures. It describes procedures, for the board membership, the initial directors, the articles of incorporation. It describes the Council's role and functions, very important, especially based on where I've come from. It states the Board of Directors' obligations. For example, there would be First Nations, Inuit and Métis, survivors of residential schools, elders, people who survived these discriminatory policies and their descendants, youth, women, men, people of diverse gender identities, and different regions of Canada, including the urban regions, the rural and remote areas. There are areas of Quebec where missionaries spoke French, and today we speak French. Many nations in Quebec speak French. So Indigenous people whose first or second language learned as French would also be on this board. Colleagues, the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provide a roadmap for us to follow. They give a roadmap to all levels of government, civil society, education and health institutions, and the private sector. And as Ms. Edith Cloutier said so well, and she's a member and spoke before the ENAN committee in the other place, and I quote, "Reconciliation requires collective and sustained efforts over time, but also the willingness to venture down uncharted paths and work together. Innovation is needed to move reconciliation forward, and it relies on trust and the complementarity of those who wish to contribute to this great reconciliation." And I'll mention, in passing, that Ms. Cloutier alone represents different realities. She's a woman, Indigenous, urban, and Francophone. So diversity is represented here, she said, at the committee. Since there are as many men as women, we must be confident that we will have the capacity, the opportunity, the will, and the innovation to choose a board of directors that is representative of Indigenous peoples of Canada. I found that very nice, and I wanted to share it with you. This important initiative requires everyone's commitment. We can, of course, say no, but this relationship that I have as the sponsor of the bill, well, there are reasons for this. It leads me to my past, our past. My commitment, it involves my commitment to the present and, above all, building a better tomorrow. That's what gets me excited, building together. We are thousands of people who can take part in this process of decolonization, and I'll tell you a little secret. I like to come up with new words in French. As an Innu and as a very creative person, I often say we need to Inuize. The children are also Wendat. Maybe they'd say, Mom, we need to Wendatize instead of decolonize. And this needs to lead me to Inuize a space and truly we're beginning to understand Canada's true history and the history of Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of great stuff that deserves to be known every day on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, apparently, on social media, in our friendships and professional relationships. We learn about the beauty of Indigenous peoples across Canada. We learn about their language. We hear about young people who remind us that we are beautiful, proud. I sense this change. Thank you to my parents for the sacrifices, to my ancestors for the sacrifices they made, and thank you to you, colleagues. Before I arrived here, I listened to you, and I saw that there are people here with open hearts, open eyes, open ears, who are ready to receive our truths. So it was not that stressful to make the move to this chamber. And I'm also aware that here in this chamber we have a collective responsibility. Institutions also have a responsibility.
To continually monitor each call to action to see meaningful and structural change necessary to improve the life of our people, or I would say the life of Indigenous people. The TRC emphasized on education as the foundation for raising awareness on what needs to happen to make true reconciliation. Tellement d'accord avec ça.
I so agree with this. Education plays a key role in eliminating ignorance, the unconscious biases about what's going on between us, about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Increasingly, educational institutions are setting curricula that take into account First Peoples' history, realities, and contemporary issues. What that does is that it has a direct impact because teachers, nurses, or other professionals in the various areas are better equipped, are better trained, and better informed. It means that when Indigenous senators arrive here, we are less asked, can you help us with this or that? No, the next generation is going to already be equipped with a great deal of information. And for that, I thank all those educational institutions. More and more, we are seeing publishers take important steps in creating that space for us. But we could also encourage them, and surely publishers could follow suit by incorporating First Peoples history as told by First People into school textbooks. That it not only rest upon the willingness of a teacher or of a faculty, but that it be integrated into the organizational culture. We know that municipalities as well, with help from communities, could certainly, if they haven't already, adopt wonderful measures to cohabitate, live together, and do things together. Imagine survivors every year who listen to the government and hear what the government is saying, what isn't working, what is working, what can't be done, when we know why it hasn't moved forward. And we're being told the truth about why it hasn't moved forward, then we can understand. But if we're not being told, or if we're being told half-truths, well, obviously, that's problematic. So here I can see that this is going to allow us to organize that for all those who, like I do, wish to understand. You know, it's not because I'm a senator. First and foremost, I'm a mother, a lover. I'm a grandmother. And I'm also a daughter. And I need to understand. The government is going to set up commissions. And I know that those are important commissions, of course, since they allow new chapters to be written. But there are not accountability mechanisms included. Commissions are voted for, but there should be accountability mechanisms attached to those commissions. What happens after the commission? So, in my opinion, Bill C-29 provides us with the opportunity to add more poles to the Chaputuan, the great Innu tent, or to take a step towards our collective responsibility. You may recall that in my inaugural speech, I shared with you that beading is something important for me. Sometimes I can take a few minutes to do so, even though the life of a senator is a busy one indeed. But I also mentioned to you that I would place beads on your path from time to time, and that if you were able to pick them up, thread them together, and thus together we could create a project of a just and fair society where each person is valued for their diversity, language, culture, values, and history, well then, I'm going to be dropping all kinds of beads on your paths. Honourable Senators, as a first experience for me, first of all, I thank you for having listened to me, for having accepted or welcomed some of my truths or those that I hold in my heart, and your questions and comments. The path taken by this legislative project, I'm sure, is going to improve things for all of us. Thank you so much.